I'm Scott Al Miller. It's the 9th of October, 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in Nicaragua. Today I've got a viewer question about my personal journey and status as a Spanish speaker, or sort of. And we're going to be talking about that today. I think it's a good chance to talk about my personal journey and how I got here, and why I'm here, and just kind of how it all fits together and how that applies to living in Nicaragua. So we're going to get to all that right after the bump.
Hear me, I'm calling. Catch me, I'm falling. Hear me, I'm calling. Catch me, I'm falling.
Happy Monday morning, everyone, and we're going to jump right in to today's question, which comes from a name I can't pronounce. It's probably just one of those username things. And he asked, or she asked, I'm just curious, how good is your Spanish? How much did you know when you came to Nicaragua? Do you actively study? How much do you use it in your day-to-day life? What minimum level of Spanish do you recommend to someone coming here? So a bit, but very, very related. This is a great question. I think a lot of people, especially when you're moving to a new country and one where you probably don't speak the language natively, have a lot of questions about the language. And I definitely, I've moved to a lot of places where I can't speak the language. I've moved to somewhere I can't read the alphabet, and it can be daunting. And especially if you're moving to like a China, a Thailand, something like that. Can be really daunting if you're not in a tourist area. If you're in tourist areas and people speak English, like you don't care what the local language is, it's not that scary. But when you move into like Chinese interior or just whatever, and it's like everyone's speaking Mandarin and you got nothing, it can be very intimidating and very stressful because you just have nothing to overcome that day to day. So this is really good questions to ask. So let's start with, how good is your Spanish? So at this point, Spanish is, you could look at it as my second or my third language, depending on how you define when something becomes your language. But at this point, I have a strong conversational Spanish. So let me preface, before we start any discussion on language, two things. One, I'm a native English speaker, just in case that was not obvious. And I grew up speaking English. I had no bilingual in my household, nothing like that. I had no exposure whatsoever on any language in any way, outside of the absolute minimum you could get from like overhearing things in movies or whatever, until I was 14. So that is my foundation. The second thing is I have hearing issues, and that's not to be like, oh no, he has hearing issues. Like, it's just I can hear sounds really, really well, but I can't pick out human voices for anything. And so one of the situations that's a really big problem for me here, and almost anywhere in learning a foreign language, is that in conversations, the places that you typically practice foreign languages are in public spaces like bars and restaurants and things like that, and in groups of people, like at parties or when like family and friends are over. And in those scenarios where other people are like, oh, I'm practicing my Spanish, I hear often nothing. Sometimes I can't even tell that there's a human voice in the sound. And this is true in English as well. In English, obviously, I have much stronger skills at picking out slight amount of sounds. But even in non-group conversations where I'm speaking to like my wife, for example, over the years, we've come to realize that I only hear roughly 50% of the words that she says. I have to fill in just what I think she said so much of the time. And this is how I am with conversation. So it's something I do all the time. So we didn't notice it so much with a single person, but in groups, I will often not, if multiple people have their mouths moving, there are times where I can't tell who's speaking, because I have nothing. And if I can't see you speaking, there's like no hope. So that place where you practice and train your ear for foreign languages is missing to me. And that is a major challenge for me just across the board. So just be aware that that is something that challenges me and doesn't challenge normal people. That's a relatively rare problem, and mine's pretty extreme. So don't expect that you'll have that same problem, but that is something that hinders my foreign language journey of any language really significantly, and something where my wife, who came from behind with me on Spanish, was able to leapfrog me because she's able to hear and converse in those situations. And so her opportunities to use Spanish are drastically longer than mine. Within a 24-hour period, if we do the same activities, I will have some of the most intense Spanish-speaking opportunities of the day. She will be able to hear perfectly well, know exactly what people said. Maybe she doesn't know the language, but she can practice. Oh, I heard this. This is what that is. I don't have that. So where she's getting practice, I'm getting gaps. And so that makes my learning process much slower than hopefully yours would be. So just to give you a preface, my Spanish is currently conversational. So if I'm in a situation where it's quiet and I'm able to hear people, I'm generally able to carry on conversations. There's certainly going to be things I missed. If people speak slowly, I do pretty well. If they talk really quickly, I'll start to fall apart. If they're talking about something very technical, where there's a lot of words I don't know, that becomes very difficult. But if it's normal conversations about day-to-day life, I can handle it quite well. When I'm responding, I'm still in a position where there's a lot of verb tenses that I don't have access to. And so I'm working to, increase that, of course. But there's a trick that people, when learning a language, do, where you use other forms of the verbs and work around it through description. And I'm still at that point, but I'm able to carry on conversations with people in most circumstances, whether it's someone I meet at the bar, or it's friends coming over to the house, or it's a taxi driver that's taking me somewhere, or someone at a restaurant. Whatever situation I'm in, I'm generally able to carry on a conversation. And I'm certainly at a point where I never need help in reading documents, whether it's a menu or a full-fledged document, doesn't matter. I'm able to read that. I can read magazine articles and books, not a problem. I'll miss some nuances, and I'm not at the same speed that I am in English, but I don't have to go looking up words basically ever, and I don't need to use any tools, right? I'm able to just read it. So that's really good. I'm able to sometimes watch Spanish television and understand it. So I'm at strong conversational Spanish at this point after many years, and the reason I said that this could be my second or my third language is I started learning Spanish much younger, and I'll get to that. I'll kind of talk about my journey in Spanish shortly, but before I was conversational in Spanish, we moved to Italy, and knowing we were going to move there, so we had a bit of warning, I put in a lot of effort studying Italian, and I had a lot of rudimentary study in Spanish, so it made learning Italian much easier, and I moved quite quickly, and I was actually conversational in Italian before I was conversational in Spanish by a couple years, maybe 4 years. But I've not used Italian for many years now, and so it would take a bit for me to get back to hearing it again and get back into the groove. But I would be able to pick up Italian quite quickly and much better now, because my Spanish now is much stronger than my Italian ever was. My Italian was rudimentary conversational Italian, and my Spanish is now pretty solid. The second part of that question is, how much did I know when I came to Nicaragua? Well, this is a little bit difficult to say. So at this point, I'm going to step back and give you my personal history in Spanish, because it'll fill you in quite a bit. So like I said, I had no exposure whatsoever to foreign languages until I was 14. I went to a private school where no language was taught ever at any age. It was not a thing that they believed in for study, and they had no resources for it. I didn't have access to libraries or television programs or anything like that when I was growing up. So my exposure to foreign languages was essentially zero. I was certainly aware that they existed, nothing weird like that, but I didn't have any learning resources at all until I switched to public school at age 14 as a freshman. When I went to high school, I was hoping to be able to study German. One of the reasons that I wanted to switch to public school, far from the only one, but one of the reasons I wanted to switch to that school was because I was really interested in being able to take a foreign language. I always thought it would be cool to be bilingual, but no resources exist. My parents had absolutely no exposure to foreign languages whatsoever. My mother, I believe, only ever studied a little bit of Latin. My father had studied a little bit of French, but certainly did not speak it and had never used it since high school. So they had no resources, no books, no anything, and I never heard spoken languages. When I got to high school, my hope was to be able to study German. My family being Schweizerdeutsch, German is the language of the family, and we were only a few generations of English speakers. So being able to speak the family language, or at least something close to it, because we had spoken Pennsylvania Dutch for a long time, and it was a Swiss form of German. I was simply looking to learn general German, thought that would be great, and I was really excited because the language teacher in my high school was a native German speaker. She was born in a German enclave, spoke only German until she went to school, and became a linguist because she had to learn English to start kindergarten. So she had been bilingual from the very beginning, speaking only English in school and only German at home through her childhood, and then marrying a Ukrainian. She spoke mostly Ukrainian at home and was teaching other languages at school, which was very strange. So but they did not offer German. They would not let me take that. That was not an option. So my options were only Spanish and French. I opted for Spanish and took 4 years of Spanish in high school. It's worth noting that it was about 3 years of Spanish as a language, and then the fourth year, while you did things in Spanish a little bit, it was very much Spanish culture, Latin American culture, and very little of actually learning more Spanish. So it's about 3 years of actual language study, and of course that's freshman, sophomore, and junior year in high school in New York at a time where no one was bilingual. I am now far more conversational in Spanish than my teacher was at that time. And so the amount of Spanish that they were able to teach was quite minimal, and the amount we learned during that time was very, very little, and no one in my classes ever approached conversational in any way whatsoever. I would say that I can learn as much in a few weeks. That's probably an over-exaggeration, but the speed at which you can learn on Duolingo now is so much faster. Now, of course, I had that foundation of several years. I learned a lot of the grammar, and that certainly helped me and gave me some foundational pieces that I still use now. So it was not wasted, and I'm very glad that I did it, but it does not give you the amount, or at least in my case, back then when there was no additional resources, right? You couldn't go practice with anybody, because even making it through high school, I'd only once in my entire life met one Spanish speaker, and they were an adult, not someone I would go talk to, and I don't know how much they spoke. I knew they grew up speaking it, and they spoke a different dialect. So it was like, that was it. One person that I met spoke Spanish. That's how isolated we were in an English-only speaking region. And it wasn't like I met people that spoke other languages. That was basically it. So no resources. I couldn't go to the library. I couldn't watch TV. You could, like today, you can just go on Netflix, set it to Spanish, and listen to people speaking Spanish from all kinds of different regions as much as you possibly want. And you have so many options. You go on YouTube and get all kinds. We didn't have any of those things. We couldn't get books on cassette or anything. So like hearing Spanish was out of the question. I didn't have books other than my textbooks from school, which were incredibly rudimentary. So it was very, very challenging. So that's what I had in high school. I did okay. I was not at the top of my class, but I was okay enough to do 4 years of it. I did okay grades, and that was it. I never used or practiced or saw or heard Spanish in any meaningful way until we traveled to Europe for almost 2 months in 2012. We did our grand tour with our young children, and during that time we were all over Europe, heard a lot of languages, and right at the end of the trip we spent more than a week in Italy and heard a lot of Italian, and then immediately went from Italy into Spain and spent several days in Spain, where we were very excited because both my wife and I had a similar Spanish background with nothing to practice since. And we got to practice a little bit of Spanish in Barcelona, which of course Spanish is not the main language of Barcelona, but you can use it there. They speak Catalan. And then we ended up in Madrid completely by chance and had like 2 days of getting to use Spanish in Madrid in 2012. And then we went on to Portugal, and that was kind of the end of it, right? So we had this incredibly tiny amount of time to use Spanish in Spain in 2012. And it was like, wow, that was so cool getting, like I could read things, I could understand a little bit here and there. It was amazing to see what we had learned in high school being put to use in some way, because everywhere else we had been, German or French or whatever, and we really didn't know anything. So that was kind of my first exposure to, you might have a way to use this potentially in the future. But at that point, I had not started using Duolingo yet. I had put in no real resources into learning another language because we were just traveling. We had no idea where we were going to end up. And if we were going to end up somewhere, we thought it was going to be Germany or possibly Italy. At that time, we were just learning a bunch of stuff about what our options were, what our future might hold. And so we were still very much looking at Germany up until that point, and just starting to look at Italy during that window, 2011, 2012. Then I, again, didn't really use any Spanish after that point. But starting in 2013, Duolingo became something on my radar, and I started using it very lightly at that time. I'd always wanted a resource for learning a foreign language, and from time to time, my wife and I would buy, Learn Italian on CD, right? And we'd put it in the car and listen to a little bit, and you'd learn a few words and a few phrases, and you're like, cool, I'm learning a language. It's not like you're really learning a language. And that's about all we had. But it had this interest, and I'd had Rosetta Stone at some point, but barely used it. With Duolingo, it was free and accessible, and I could do it on my phone, and that changed things for me. And it took me a couple years before I really started using it. I used it extremely lightly in 2013, pretty lightly in 2014. At the beginning of 2015, we knew we were going to be moving abroad, and we had talked about it for a long time and said, you know, Spain is really where we want to start our journey, our discovery of where we might want to live, what is really of interest to us. And so at that point, I started putting in real effort into learning Spanish and essentially went through all of Duolingo way back when. And Janet just had a comment on the show from last week about how Duolingo has changed so much and added so much that for those of us who went through, like I completed Spanish and Italian in Duolingo, and now when you look at my Spanish and Italian, like I feel like I've barely gotten started. They're so big now. And for those of you who haven't seen my streak, I'm currently on a 1,304-day streak on Duolingo on Spanish, and I've had something like a 600 or 700-day streak in the past, and I had streaks of 30 to maybe 100 to 120 days prior to that. Like I have some big streaks. I probably have more than 2,000 or 3,000 days of doing Duolingo, and so I've completed Spanish and Italian at some point, and now I feel like they add more to it faster than I can learn it, which is great. There's always something more for me to learn, so that part's good, but wow, it's huge. So in early 2015, we ended up moving to Spain and spent the rest of the year moving through Spanish-speaking countries. We actually moved, we gave up our home, moved completely away, and started living kind of a vagabond life, going to visa limits wherever we could, and living in a lot of different places. But early on in our traveling journeys, we lived in Spain, where we certainly kept using, both of us were doing Duolingo a lot, trying to speak where we could, and we were reading Spanish all the time, right? It's Castilian Spanish in Andalusia, and we leapt forward because we were practicing. And one of my best friends today, we had only just gotten to know each other a little bit at that point, so she was a new friend at the time, and she lived in Panama, and she would coach me a lot. When I had questions, I had finally found, this is completely coincidental, that at the time I moved to Spain, I also had a friend who spoke Spanish natively. She's Venezuelan, not Panamanian. And she could help me with what I was like, I don't understand this. Why is it like this? And she's very tri or quadlingual. And so her ability to completely speak English as well as any English speaker, and had completely native Spanish and could understand the rules of both and translate things for me, was huge. So it was a resource I had never had anywhere, not in any university, not in anything throughout my life. And so she did a lot to help me through hard parts where I just didn't have resources for things. But having that high school foundation, and then Duolingo, and then going to Spain and having someone that I could comfortably ask, why does it say that? Why do you say it like this? Right? And work through, oh, now I understand the translation or whatever. Now I know it's a verb that's different than I thought. So living in Spain, we started speaking, and then we lived in Panama briefly. That did very little to help, because living in Panama, we had so much isolation just because of where we lived and how we lived and what was going on with our lives at the time. We were mostly isolated to a high-rise resort, which was fantastic in a lot of ways, but we didn't go out and spend loads of time interacting with public. We didn't have a bar that we went and hung out at. We didn't go clubbing with people. We didn't go meet a lot of people while in Panama, and those that we did often were English speakers. Like Paul that lives with us now, he came down and hung out in Panama while we were there, and other friends came down, and we would, go visit people, but we'd all be speaking English. So the Panama has a lot more English speakers, right? So the between the isolation and the not that much Spanish, we almost took a break, it seemed like, even though we were in a Spanish native country. But from there we moved to Nicaragua. So when I first moved to Nicaragua, my Spanish was incredibly rudimentary. I would not go out and have conversations with people. I can remember times where I'd be stopped by someone on the street. They tried to sell me a sandwich. We'd have this really basic interaction of trying to pay for a sandwich or whatever. And it was fine. I could hear a lot of words, but I really couldn't speak Spanish. We then left Nicaragua and were gone for many years, and at no point in the interim did we live in a Spanish-speaking country. We lived in places that spoke Italian and Greek and Ukrainian and Romanian, so we were being exposed to a lot of languages, and I took a lot of time off from studying Spanish during that time because I was working very hard on Italian, and I worked a bit on Romanian, and I threw some other things in, and I would do Spanish from time to time, but I really wasn't focused on Spanish for a very long time. Then around 2019, we started talking about moving back to Nicaragua and started looking at Latin America as almost certainly where our long-term home base was going to be. And because of that, I started working on Spanish very heavily, again, through Duolingo. I didn't really have any other resources. So a little bit in 2019, a lot in 2020, basically all of late 2019 and all of 2020, and since has been very focused on speaking Spanish. So when we returned to Nicaragua in 2021, I had a much increased level of Spanish, but I was still not conversational. I was not as good as I was in Italian when we lived in Italy. But I was at a point where my Duolingo journey was quite far along. I think I had already been through like over 1,500 days of Duolingo Spanish, and my ability to read Spanish was starting to be there. It was really coming along. It felt very comfortable doing things in Spanish, but it was not conversational. It's like I could say the words, I knew the names of things, I could read everything, and it definitely gave me a level of comfort. And my wife had less Spanish than me, but a bit. And between us, we really were able to do a lot of things in Spanish. Now, Paul, who moved down at that time, had essentially none. He had never taken Spanish before. He had never done language studies. He had not put time into preparing ahead of time. He came down as an essentially pure English speaker to Nicaragua. So we have three very different stories. My wife came from behind me, and because she can hear and uses it in conversation a lot more, she has flown past me in Spanish. She speaks really, really well. At this point, I've advanced dramatically, but I've done it while being here, and you know, the more you speak, the easier it is. But I think we handled it really well getting here. And then Paul came down with nothing and has been learning, but he has not put a lot of effort into study. He doesn't do Duolingo every day. My wife and I both do. My kids do. You know, he's not studying the grammar. He's trying to learn by listening, and he certainly has improved, and he says things, but he's not conversational in any way. And it's really noticeable, the difference of pace that we go through and the types of interactions we're able to have, and how we get to relate to people. The next question is, how much do we use it in our everyday life? Well, this is going to vary a lot, so I'll talk about me. For me personally, I use Spanish absolutely every day, partially because I can. Once you have any amount of Spanish, you're going to want to use it, both for practice and because it just makes life easier. It changes the way that people interact with you. So you're not going to want to have it and not use it in most circumstances, and since we have it, we do use it. The final question is, how much Spanish do you need to have before moving to Nicaragua? And this is difficult because your experiences are going to vary, and what you plan to do, where you plan to live, and a lot of things are going to be factors. But in general, this is my advice. When traveling anywhere in the world, you don't worry about learning a language before you go, because you're not going to ever learn that language. If you're going to visit Greece, which I highly recommend, it's a wonderful place, you're not going to learn Greek. You're not even going to learn to read the alphabet before you go. You're going to muddle through. That's what you do when you travel. Now, granted, when you move to a place, you have more need to speak the language than when being a tourist. But remember, when you first get to Nicaragua, you are a tourist. It starts that way, and over time you become a resident if that's your goal. If you're just visiting, then you're always a tourist, right? So from that aspect, there's never really a need to learn the language before you visit somewhere. And if that was true, I would never get to go to places like Japan or Korea or China. They'd be off limits to me because I'm never going to learn those languages. No offense to those countries, your languages are really hard for me. I'm an English native speaker. I can only learn so many languages. I'm working on 3. I have my limits. I'm sorry. But that's just the way it is to travel, right? So from a pure travel perspective, I think it's really important to never say that question, right? Just say, oh, you don't need to speak a language to travel somewhere. It's just part of being a tourist. People will always help you. It doesn't matter where in the world you go, right? People are generally friendly. People who are helping you buy products from them, right? Restaurants or whatever, they're going to help you. The more you can speak, the more you can get out of any given travel experience. But realistically, you can't learn languages for every place you're going to visit. If you know you want to vacation in Latin America and or Spain for the rest of your lives, and every year you're going to spend weeks or maybe months somewhere in a Spanish-speaking zone, yeah, put in all kinds of time learning Spanish for sure. They'll benefit you forever in different ways. But in normal life, don't worry about learning a language before you go. I know that's not very helpful on its own. So let's talk about, if you're moving to Nicaragua, you know your plan is to make a life. How much Spanish do you need to know before you get here? A couple different things need to be said. The first is you just don't need any, especially if you're going to be in some place like Granada or San Juan del Sur. There's a lot of people who speak English, and you'll find that you're probably able to make do just fine without ever learning Spanish. Will you have negatives? Absolutely. There's going to be things that you're once in a while you're going to be like, I need a translator, or I got to use an app when I don't want to, or reading a menu is hard, right? There's going to be things. No matter what, you're likely to pick up a certain amount of Spanish pretty quickly, at least reading menus and stuff and street signs, things like that. That's going to be real fast, even if you put in zero effort, never intend to learn Spanish. But if you put in a little bit of effort, you're going to find that over time you learn quite a bit of Spanish, and you will get more and more interaction because of that, simply in an organic way. But no matter where you're coming, let's just say you're coming out here to Leon or maybe up to Jinotega, one of the areas where the amount of English speaking is extremely low, the lowest you're going to find in the country, or let's use El Viejo in Chinandega, something that's really out there. You're never going to encounter expats. Even in those locations, you're going to be able to get by not speaking Spanish adequately. If your goal is to be able to go to the bar and make new friends automatically, just go into a bar, sit down, start talking, you're not going to be able to do that unless you speak Spanish or get extremely lucky in running across someone who speaks English. It can happen, but it's rare. Those who watch my show all the time know that sometimes I'm walking down the street and someone will grab me and start speaking in English, but it's rare. It's 1 out of 1,000 people, not 1 out of 5. So you have to assume you're not going to be carrying on conversations with people, but that's okay. What you are likely going to do is have an interaction where you're only interacting with English speakers, or you're only interacting with Spanish speakers through translator apps, through pointing and asking questions and things like that. It's going to be a very limited experience. And if that's okay until you get to a point where you learn more Spanish, then you're fine moving down. None of that should hold you back from moving down. Right? Just be aware there's going to be these barriers where you're going to only be able to interact with this very small amount of the population until you learn Spanish. And if you're going to live near an enclave or in an enclave, you might be fine. Plenty of English speakers. If you're mostly just making friends online and you don't need to interact with your neighbors, then fine. You don't need that Spanish. So what you're looking to get out of the lifestyle is going to play a really big role in how much you need in order to accommodate that. But for the most part, are you going to be able to go to the movie theater and see a movie? Because they'll do English subtitles. Are you going to be able to go to a restaurant and get food? Are you going to be able to drive around and see things? Are you going to be able to do touristy things? You're going to be able to get, basic, rent an apartment and all that? Yeah, sometimes it's going to be a bit of a hassle, but you're going to be able to do all those things. You're not going to be unable to move here or unable to live because you speak zero Spanish. That won't be a problem. It'll add challenge. It'll slow things down. It'll make you frustrated at times, but it's not something to halt your process on. So the takeaway that I'm trying to get here, the distillment of what I'm trying to say is that if you want to move to Nicaragua, do not let a lack of Spanish today hold you back in any way from moving down. Go ahead, move down. If you have zero Spanish today, you want to move to Nicaragua. That's a big moment to be at. But if that's the case, go ahead, pack your bags, get on the plane. You'll muddle through. If the question is, I want to move to Nicaragua sometime in the future, when do I start learning Spanish? It doesn't matter how far away that date is, whether it's tomorrow or in 5 years. The answer to when do I start studying Spanish is today. Okay, in both cases, nothing should be holding you back. The amount of time before you need to speak Spanish should not hold you back from learning Spanish. You should start immediately. The most important aspect of the habit of learning a language is not delaying. It is not pushing off, not procrastinating. Well, I'm not moving for a while, I'm going to start learning tomorrow. That's not how learning works. Learning starts now. Once you start saying, I'm going to do it tomorrow, and take this from a person who has educated and worked with people in career development for decades. Every time someone says, great, I'm going to get to that tomorrow, that is how you tell your brain, I don't care, I'm not doing it. Right? People who are going to learn, start learning. People who are not going to learn, say they'll learn tomorrow. No one says I'm not going to learn, right? That's not what we do. We say, I'm going to get to it. No, you're not. You are lying to yourself and then using that to lie to me. I don't know why you're lying to me, because I don't care. But don't lie to yourself. If you have no intention of learning Spanish, say, I'm not doing it. And if you are planning to learn Spanish, take your phone out, download Duolingo, and start using it right now. It doesn't matter if you only use it for one day and you say, I don't like this app. Right? I want Rosetta Stone. I want a human. I want a class. I want whatever. That is an enhancement you can do tomorrow. But if you're going to start learning, you're going to do it today. That's a guarantee. If it's something you're going to get off the couch, you don't have to get off the couch. Pull your phone out, Go sit at a web browser, whatever, duolingo.com, find a different app immediately. If you're like, I don't want, Scott, I don't trust you on this Duolingo thing, I don't care. Go get Babbel, go get Rosetta Stone, it doesn't matter. Send me an email and say, hook me up with someone who teaches a language, whatever, right? Start now. That is the answer for when you start learning. But it doesn't matter no matter where you are in your language learning journey, come to Nicaragua when you're ready to come to Nicaragua. The sooner you get here, the sooner you will accelerate your Spanish learning by having exposure, not just to Spanish, but to Nicaraguan Spanish, which is very difficult to get exposure to at other times. So those are the important things, right? Don't let it hold you back because you don't have Spanish. Don't let it hold you back from learning Spanish because you aren't ready to move. Both of those things happen independently from each other, and neither should delay because of the other. And that will give you the maximum benefits. Yes, the more Spanish you have, the more you will get out of the Nicaraguan experience. And the sooner you learn it, the sooner you get to partake of that experience. So it's a positive, but you shouldn't let it hold you back. And if you're a terrible language learner, you're like, I'm really afraid I'm never going to learn it. Ask yourself, is that really a problem? Is never learning it actually realistic? That you'll never, are you going to move and live here full time? You'll probably learn Spanish, unless you're really going to an enclave. But are you really looking to not learn ever? Some people can't, but for the most part you can. But Paul's a great example. He's been here for years, right? He first came to Panama in 2015, Costa Rica, also in 2015, has known he's been living here since 2019 and has been here since early 2021, and he speaks extremely little Spanish, and he gets along just fine. Loves it here, doesn't find it a major problem, uses Google Translate, has picked up some stuff, hears a few things, but cannot carry on conversations, and it is not a problem for him. He's a great example of you can go indefinitely without learning Spanish. Does it limit the things he can do? Yeah, there are things that he can't do as easily, or things that he doesn't enjoy as much because he can't do it in Spanish. He can't just go to the movies and watch a non-subtitled movie, for example, whereas I did that recently and it was hard, but I did. Right? That's a barrier, but he can go to restaurants. He can deal with businesses. He can deal with investments. He can deal with driving. He can deal with going to meetings. He can do like all kinds of things. He's able to function with very rudimentary, non-conversational Spanish after many years here, and that's not a major problem. That is a lot of thunder. The sky is basically clear. There's a ton of thunder coming out from that direction, and so that's a great example of you just don't need the Spanish. But my wife is also a great example. She has become extremely conversational, able to have very casual, rapid conversations with people, able to understand most conversations going on. And because of that, she has so much more of a social experience. She can go anywhere, anytime, just sit down and start talking to people, random people, strangers, doesn't matter. She's able to start talking to them. And they know that she's not a native speaker, but she speaks enough that she's able to really participate in a lot of things and overhear other people's conversations and join in casually. You don't have to make an effort at it, and it's made it much easier for her to do more things. She's also very social, likes to go out a lot more, so that's there are benefits to it, but in time that's going to happen naturally. So certainly learning Spanish is good. Start right away, but don't let any of these things hold you back. I know it feels like these things might be barriers, and I think if you really think about it, if I travel, and maybe some of you have never traveled, right, so you don't have these experiences. Like, I've traveled all over Europe. I've been to many, many countries where I speak nothing of the language. It's never a problem. If I live there, it creates barriers, of course. But like, I moved to Romania. I never learned to speak any Romanian. I tried. It was really hard. I learned like nothing. You learn like thank you and please, but you never get beyond that, right? Really, really hard. And I had no problems living in Romania, and very few people spoke English. There was one priest who lived across the street who knew just a little English. There was one girl way down the block who she could speak English, but she was a middle schooler, right? But she would come translate once in a while when we needed something. That was it. There was no one else in the village that spoke English. Nobody. One guy spoke Italian, but that was before I learned Italian, right? So we would say some things in Italian because at least we could hear it a lot better. Hearing Romanian, like, we couldn't hear the words. That it wasn't a problem there. And we lived in Greece, spoke nothing of Greek, nothing at all, couldn't even read the alphabet. We could say the words, but the letters, but we couldn't use them in any way. Still not a problem. Sure, It would have been even better if we spoke Greek. We don't need it. So once you realize, oh wait, you can really just do all those things anywhere without the language, even places that are not touristy, because we were not in touristy locations in any of those places, then I think it makes sense. Oh, you don't need it here either. You will muddle through. You will almost certainly learn tons of Spanish as you do it. You will get better and better, and everything will come together. Don't let these things hold you back. Just make it happen. If this is what you want, make it. Make it the thing that you do. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for the question. Like and subscribe. As always, post on social media. If you'd like to support the channel, buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller, and tell your friends about the show. I will see all of you tomorrow.